It's been years since my little country house saw so much life. The quiet rhythm of my days, marked by the soft hum of birdsong in the mornings and the gentle creak of wooden floorboards as I moved through the rooms, had become a kind of sanctuary. But all that changed yesterday afternoon when Leo arrived with his friend Ethan in tow. They burst through the door like a whirlwind, their energy filling every corner of the space. Laughter spilled from their lips, mingling with the faint rustle of chip bags and soda cans they carried. They talked over each other excitedly about some new video game, their voices rising and falling in an animated cadence that felt almost foreign after so many months of solitude. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, watching them take up residence in my home as though it were second nature to them. Leo was the first to notice me standing by the kitchen counter, arms crossed lightly over my chest. His face lit up with a grin as he dropped his backpack onto the couch without ceremony. "Hey, Grandma," he said, bounding over to wrap me in a tight hug. I held him close, marveling at how tall he'd grown since our last visit. It seemed impossible that this young man before me, the one whose shoulders now nearly matched mine, was once the small boy who used to beg me for bedtime stories. Behind him lingered Ethan, his presence quieter but no less striking. He hung back just slightly, observing the scene with an easygoing charm that immediately set him apart. When Leo finally stepped aside, Ethan offered a shy smile, his dark curls falling into his eyes in a way that made him look both boyish and impossibly mature at the same time. "This is Ethan," Leo announced proudly, gesturing toward his friend with a flourish. "You remember, right? We talked about him last week." Of course I remembered. How could I forget? Leo had spent weeks regaling me with tales of Ethan's exploits, his quick wit, his knack for solving puzzles, his uncanny ability to win any argument. To hear Leo tell it, Ethan wasn't just a friend, he was practically a legend. And yet, seeing him in person was different. There was something magnetic about him, something that transcended the stories. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, with an easy confidence that seemed unusual for someone so young, or maybe it was the warmth in his voice when he spoke. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Harper," Ethan said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, steady, and surprisingly adult. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and I felt seen, not in the casual way people often glance at one another during introductions, but in a way that felt deliberate, thoughtful. It was as if you were looking past the surface, the gray hair, the wrinkles, the apron tied loosely around my waist, and seeing something deeper, something real. I quickly looked away, busying myself with unpacking groceries. What nonsense, I thought, shaking my head slightly. A woman my age shouldn't be flustered by an 18-year-old boy. And yet there it was, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirring beneath the surface. I told myself it was nothing more than surprise, the natural reaction of someone unaccustomed to such youthful exuberance crashing into her carefully ordered world. But deep down, I knew better. There was something about Ethan that unsettled me, not in a bad way, but in a way that made me acutely aware of my own invisibility these past few years. As I turned back to the counter, pretending to focus on arranging apples in a bowl, I caught sight of the two boys settling onto the couch. Their laughter filled the room again, bright and unrestrained, and for a fleeting moment I allowed myself to bask in it. Life, I realized, had a way of sneaking up on you when you least expected it. The boys wasted no time settling in. By evening they were sprawled on the porch steps, sharing jokes and eating chips like they hadn't a care in the world. Their laughter floated through the warm summer air, mingling with the faint hum of cicadas in the distance. I watched them from the corner of my eye as I carried out a tray of lemonade, feeling both grateful for their energy and slightly overwhelmed by it. They seemed so effortlessly alive, so full of life, qualities that felt distant to me now, buried under years of routine and quiet solitude. Ethan glanced up as I set the tray down between them, his gaze lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks, Mrs. Harper," he said softly, brushing a stray crumb off his jeans. His voice was warm, sincere, almost too thoughtful for someone his age. "You didn't have to go through all this trouble." "It's no trouble," I replied quickly, forcing a smile that I hoped looked natural. But his words stayed with me long after I retreated inside, echoing in my mind like a melody I couldn't quite place. There was something about the way he said it, not just polite but genuinely appreciative, that made me pause. It wasn't the kind of gratitude people exchanged out of habit. It felt deeper, more personal. And though I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than good manners, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. Later that night, as I sat reading by the fireplace, the house had grown quiet except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. The book in my hands was one I'd read before, its pages worn soft from years of use, but my attention kept drifting elsewhere. My thoughts wandered back to earlier, to Ethan's lingering gaze, the warmth in his voice, and I scolded myself silently. "He's just being polite," I told myself firmly. "Don't overthink it." But then I heard footsteps approaching, slow and hesitant, breaking the stillness. I looked up to see Ethan standing awkwardly in the doorway, holding a book in one hand. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, as if unsure whether he should speak or turn around and leave. "Mind if I join you?" he asked finally, lifting the book slightly as if to explain himself. Leo fell asleep already, and I figured I'd find something to read. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding, gesturing toward the armchair across from mine. "Of course, make yourself comfortable." He settled into the chair, tucking one leg underneath him as he opened the book and flipped through the pages absently. For a while, neither of us spoke. The crackling fire filled the silence, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then, almost casually, he glanced up at me. "What are you reading?" I held up the cover for him to see, expecting him to nod politely and return to his own book. Instead, he surprised me by asking, "Do you like it? Or is it one of those books you feel obligated to finish because you started it?" His question caught me off guard, not because it was intrusive, but because it was unexpectedly perceptive. I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep inside, and shook my head. "A little of both, honestly. Sometimes I think I keep these old books around more out of nostalgia than anything else." We ended up chatting for hours, the conversation flowing easily despite the generational gap between us. We talked about books first, discovering a shared love for classic literature, though our tastes diverged when it came to modern authors. From there, the discussion shifted to music. He mentioned an indie band I'd never heard of, and I countered with stories of vinyl records and late-night radio shows from my youth. Eventually, he asked about my days as a teacher, and I found myself recounting anecdotes I hadn't thought of in years. The mischievous students who always seemed to sit in the back row, the classroom experiments that went hilariously wrong, the bittersweet pride of watching graduates walk across the stage. To my surprise, Ethan listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration as if every word mattered. He asked questions that showed he was truly engaged, not just nodding along but genuinely curious. "Did you ever get tired of it?" he asked at one point. "Teaching, I mean, dealing with kids all day must have been exhausting." I considered the question carefully before answering. There were days when it felt overwhelming, yes, but most of the time it wasn't about exhaustion, it was about connection. Seeing a student finally understand something they'd been struggling with, or hearing them laugh during a lesson, those moments made everything worth it. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's really cool, you sound like you were amazing at it." The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. "Thank you," I said quietly, looking away. Compliments weren't something I received often these days, especially not ones delivered with such earnest sincerity. When he finally stood to leave, stretching lazily and glancing toward the stairs where Leo was presumably still asleep, I realized I hadn't laughed this hard or felt this scene in months, maybe even years. As he turned to go, he paused in the doorway, glancing back at me with a small, almost shy smile. "Thanks for letting me hang out with you, it was nice." "You're welcome," I replied, returning his smile. "Anytime." And as he disappeared upstairs, I leaned back in my chair, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The house felt different somehow, not emptier but fuller, as if his presence had left an imprint on the space. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel quite so invisible. Over the next few days, Ethan began seeking me out more often. While Leo fished in the nearby stream or played games on his phone, Ethan would appear beside me, helping with chores, asking about the garden, or simply sitting quietly as I worked. At first, I told myself it was harmless, just the actions of a polite and considerate young man. But there was something deliberate in the way he positioned himself near me, something almost magnetic that drew him closer each time. His presence became a constant hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, one I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. One afternoon, we found ourselves pruning roses together. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light across the yard and warming the earth beneath our feet. The air smelled sweet from the blooms, their petals soft against my fingertips as I carefully trimmed away dead leaves. Ethan knelt beside me, his movements steady but unpracticed, his hands brushing against mine as he handed me the clippers. The contact sent a jolt through me, a spark I couldn't explain, and for a moment I froze, unsure whether to pull away or pretend nothing had happened. "You're really good at this," he said after a pause, gesturing toward the neatly trimmed bushes. His voice was warm, admiring, and tinged with something else I couldn't quite place. "Do you miss teaching?" The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me that in years, not since my retirement party where colleagues offered kind words before moving on with their lives. It wasn't something I allowed myself to dwell on. The past felt too distant, too wrapped up in memories I preferred to keep tucked away. Yet here was Ethan, looking at me with an earnest curiosity that made it impossible to brush him off. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice softer than I intended. I focused on the rose bush in front of me, avoiding his gaze. "But it's nice to slow down, too." He nodded thoughtfully, his fingers absently tracing the stem of a rose. There was a quiet intensity in his expression, as though he were piecing together fragments of a puzzle only he could see. "I bet your students loved having you around," he said finally. "You seem like the kind of person who makes people feel special." His words unsettled me, not because they were untrue, but because they stirred something deep inside, something I'd buried long ago. For years, I had convinced myself that being invisible was part of growing older, that the world naturally turned its attention elsewhere as life marched forward. But now, under Ethan's watchful eyes, I felt seen in a way that left me both exhilarated and uneasy. I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Oh, I don't know about all that, I was just doing my job." "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "It's more than that, you have this energy. Like you care not just about the big things, but the little ones too." He paused, glancing at me briefly before looking back at the flowers. "It's rare, most people don't notice the details anymore." I didn't know what to say. His observations cut too close to truths I had spent years hiding, from the longing for connection, the ache of feeling forgotten, the desire to matter to someone, anyone. and yet hearing those words from him felt wrong, dangerous even. He was 18, practically a child compared to me. What right did I have to entertain such thoughts, to let them take root and grow? Still, I couldn't deny the warmth spreading through my chest, the way his praise lingered in the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. I busied myself with the task at hand, snipping another stem with perhaps more force than necessary. Well, I said lightly, if I'm so observant, maybe you should tell me why you've been spending so much time with an old lady like me instead of enjoying your summer with Leo. He smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe I just like talking to you, he said simply. Is that so hard to believe? Yes, I replied without thinking, the word slipping out before I could stop it. I immediately regretted it, the sharpness of my tone surprising even myself. I trailed off, searching for a way to soften the blow. You're young, Ethan. You should be out exploring, living your life, not wasting it chatting with me. His brow furrowed slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw hurt flicker across his face, but then he shrugged, masking it with a casual grin. Who says I'm wasting it? He countered. Besides, not everything has to be about age, does it? The question hung between us, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to argue, to remind him of the decades separating us, of the societal norms dictating what was acceptable and what wasn't. But the truth was, I didn't want to hear those arguments myself. They felt hollow, meaningless in the face of the emotions swirling inside me. Instead, I turned back to the roses, focusing on the rhythmic snip of the clippers. Let's finish these before dinner, I suggested, my voice steady despite the storm raging within. Leo will be hungry soon. Ethan nodded, falling silent as we worked side by side. But I could feel his gaze lingering on me, thoughtful and probing, as if he were waiting for me to say something more. And though I refused to meet his eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever fragile line existed between us was beginning to blur. By the time we finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. We stood there for a moment, surveying our work, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on us. Then Ethan broke the silence. Thanks for letting me help, he said softly, his tone carrying a note of gratitude that went beyond the simple act of gardening. It means a lot, I nodded, forcing a smile. Anytime. As he walked away, heading toward the house where Leo waited, I stayed behind, leaning against the fence and staring at the fading light. My heart raced, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Guilt warred with longing, logic battled desire, and somewhere in the chaos, I realized something terrifying. Ethan had awakened a part of me I thought was long gone. That evening we gathered under the grapevine on the patio, sipping wine as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky blazed with streaks of amber and rose, casting a warm glow over everything it touched. Leo excused himself early, claiming he needed to charge his phone, leaving Ethan and me alone beneath the canopy of twisting vines. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy, charged with something unspoken that hovered between us like an invisible thread. The air smelled faintly of ripening grapes and earth, mingling with the cool breeze that carried away the last remnants of daylight. I could feel Ethan's presence beside me, steady and magnetic, pulling at something deep within me that I didn't want to acknowledge. He shifted slightly, leaning closer until his knee brushed against mine. It was accidental, or maybe not, but the contact sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric. Before I could process what was happening, he reached for my hand. His fingers grazed mine tentatively at first, then closed around them with a feather-light touch that felt deliberate, intentional. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unsure whether to pull away or stay still. What are you doing? I whispered, my voice barely audible above the soft rustle of leaves overhead. I tried to pull my hand free, but his grip tightened just enough to hold me there, not forcefully, but with a quiet insistence that made my heart race. I'm sorry, he murmured, his gaze locked onto mine. His eyes were wide, earnest, filled with a vulnerability that disarmed me completely. I'm so sorry, I can't help myself. My chest tightened and I stared at him, searching for any trace of mockery, of cruelty, anything that might explain this absurd moment. But there was nothing, only sincerity etched into every line of his face, only the raw honesty of someone who had been holding back too long. This isn't right, I said firmly, though my voice wavered, betraying the storm raging inside me. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, blurring my vision. I wanted to slap him, to shake him, to remind him of the decades between us, of how wrong this was, how impossible. But another part of me, a part I barely recognized, was burning with longing, a part that craved connection, intimacy, validation. That part whispered cruel lies. What harm is one touch, one moment? I know, Ethan replied softly, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles on my palm. Each movement sent shivers racing up my arm, igniting sensations I thought I'd buried years ago. But it doesn't change how I feel. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. They settled over me like a weight, pressing down on the fragile walls I'd built around myself. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was confused, mistaken, wrong. But the truth was, I couldn't deny the way my pulse quickened when he looked at me, the way his touch awakened something dormant within me. Tears spilled down my cheeks now, hot and silent. I hated myself for crying, for showing weakness in front of him. And yet I couldn't stop. Part of me ached to push him away, to protect us both from the consequences of this reckless act. But another part, a darker, more selfish part, wanted to lean into his warmth, to let myself be seen and wanted and alive, if only for a fleeting moment. Ethan, I began, my voice breaking. We can't. I know, he interrupted gently, his expression pained but resolute. But I had to tell you, I couldn't keep pretending. The sun disappeared entirely now, plunging the world into twilight. Shadows crept across the patio, wrapping us in their quiet embrace. In that dim light, the boundaries between right and wrong seemed to blur, leaving only the two of us suspended in a fragile, dangerous space. After that night, things shifted. Ethan kept his distance, retreating into himself while Leo remained blissfully unaware of the tension hanging in the air. I replayed the moment under the grapevine over and over in my mind, dissecting every word, every touch, as though by examining it closely enough I might find some clarity. But no matter how many times I revisited it, the truth remained stubbornly elusive. What happened between us was wrong. Terribly, undeniably wrong. And yet it awakened something within me, something I thought had long been buried. Was it wrong? Yes. Did it awaken something within me? Absolutely. For years I felt invisible, as if the world had moved on without me. My children grew up and started their own lives, my husband passed away, and I resigned myself to solitude. The quiet rhythm of my days became both a comfort and a cage, a predictable pattern that left little room for surprises or connection. But then Ethan came along with his easy charm and thoughtful questions, and suddenly the walls I'd built around myself began to crack. His attentiveness wasn't just flattering, it was intoxicating. It reminded me what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, not as someone's mother or aunt or widow, but as a person capable of desire, of longing, of life. But now, sitting alone in the stillness of my home, I can't ignore the weight of what we've done. The guilt gnaws at me, sharp and unrelenting, whispering cruel truths I don't want to face. How could I let myself entertain such thoughts? He's practically a child compared to me, a boy who grew up under my watchful eye, who trusted me to guide him, not lead him astray. And yet, was I once young too? Didn't I once crave passion and connection, the kind that makes your heart race and your breath catch? I remember those days vividly. The thrill of stolen glances, the rush of forbidden feelings, the way love or lust could consume you whole. Back then, I never imagined growing old would mean growing invisible. I never imagined the fire inside me would dim, replaced by the slow, steady burn of routine and responsibility. Yet here I am decades later, grappling with emotions I thought I'd outgrown. Ethan's presence stirred something deep within me, something primal and raw. It wasn't just about him, it was about me, about reclaiming a part of myself I feared was lost forever. When he reached for my hand, when his lips brushed against mine, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a reminder that I am still alive, still capable of feeling. And maybe that's why I can't bring myself to regret it, not entirely anyway. But regret isn't the only thing keeping me awake at night. There's also fear. Fear of what this means, of where it leads, of how it changes everything. If anyone found out, they wouldn't understand. They'd see only the surface, the age gap, the familial ties, and judge us harshly. They wouldn't see the vulnerability in Ethan's eyes, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. They wouldn't understand how lonely I've been, how desperately I needed to feel wanted again. And yet, even as I try to justify it to myself, I know better. This isn't just about loneliness or desire. It's about boundaries, lines we weren't meant to cross. Lines I promised myself I'd never blur, so why did I let it happen? Why did I lean into his touch instead of pulling away? Was it selfishness, weakness, or was it something deeper, something I'm not ready to confront? The hardest part is knowing there's no going back. No matter how much I wish I could erase that night, it's etched into my memory, burned into my skin like a brand. Every time I look at Ethan, I see it, the spark in his gaze, the unspoken question lingering between us. Does he regret it? Does he feel the same turmoil I do, torn between guilt and longing? Or is he simply moving on, leaving me to carry the weight of what we've done? Leo's laughter drifts through the house, pulling me from my thoughts. For a moment, I envy his innocence, his ability to exist in a world untouched by complications. If only I could go back to that simplicity, to a time before I knew what it felt like to yearn for something so dangerous, so impossible. Yet even as I chastise myself for letting this happen, I can't deny the truth. Ethan made me feel alive again. In his arms, I wasn't just Margaret, the aging widow, or the distant relative. I was someone worth seeing, worth wanting. Maybe that's the cruelest part of all, that in giving into temptation, I found a piece of myself I didn't realize I'd lost. But at what cost? On the morning they left, I hugged Leo tightly, telling him to visit again soon. His arms wrapped around me with the easy affection of a child who still saw the world in simple terms, black and white, right and wrong. He didn't know how complicated life could be, how tangled emotions could become when boundaries blurred and hearts collided. When it was Ethan's turn, he hesitated, his eyes searching mine as though trying to memorize every detail before stepping away for good. "Take care, Mrs. Harper," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret but steady all the same. There was so much unspoken in those few words, a goodbye, an apology, perhaps even a silent plea for understanding. "You too, Ethan," I replied, forcing a smile that felt brittle on my lips. My chest tightened as I watched him step back, putting distance between us where there had once been none. The air seemed colder now, heavier, as if the weight of everything we'd shared pressed down on me all at once. As their car pulled out of the driveway, I stood rooted to the spot, clutching my sweater tightly around me. The engine's hum faded into the distance, leaving behind an emptiness that echoed through the house like a hollow ache. It wasn't just the absence of their voices or laughter. It was the absence of him, of the connection we'd forged beneath layers of guilt and longing. I walked slowly toward the grapevine, its twisted vines casting dappled shadows across the patio. Running my fingers along its rough surface, I thought about how much had changed since they'd arrived. What began as a quiet summer interlude had unraveled into something far more complex, something I couldn't undo no matter how hard I tried. What happened between Ethan and me will remain a secret, locked away in the recesses of my heart. It was wrong, yes, but it also reminded me that I'm still capable of feeling, of yearning, of being desired. For years, I'd convinced myself that such desires belonged to someone else, to a version of me who existed before loneliness became a constant companion. But Ethan had awakened something within me, something raw and undeniable. And while I knew it shouldn't have happened, part of me couldn't bring myself to wish it away entirely. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the yard. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth seep into my skin, and exhaled deeply. Life is messy, I realized. Human emotions don't fit neatly into boxes. They spill over, complicating relationships and blurring lines we swore never to cross. Yet, isn't that what makes us human? Our capacity to feel deeply, to love fiercely, even when it hurts. Ethan's departure marked the end of this chapter, but not the story itself. The memories would linger, bittersweet reminders of a fleeting moment when I allowed myself to be seen, truly seen, by someone who looked at me not as a widow or a caretaker, but as a person worthy of attention. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be. Turning away from the grapevine, I headed back inside, the screen door creaking softly behind me. The house felt quieter now, its walls holding onto echoes of laughter and whispered confessions. As I moved through the familiar rooms, I told myself I'd find peace here again someday. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but eventually. And maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to navigate the chaos of our lives with grace, to forgive ourselves for the choices we make, and to remember that even in our darkest moments, there's beauty in simply being alive.